The familiar order. There was a rhythm to the days. Not one that had been chosen consciously, but one that had settled in over time, like a well-worn path that no longer needed attention. Things happened when they were meant to happen. Morning followed night. Tasks followed plans. Words followed expectations. From the outside, it looked like balance. The observer could see how everything fit together neatly enough. Actions had reasons. Reactions had explanations. There was a sense of direction, even if it was rarely questioned. Life moved forward, step by step, without asking for much more than participation. And participation came easily. The body knew what to do before thought arrived. Hands moved. Decisions were made. Conversations flowed in familiar patterns. There was comfort in knowing what came next, even if it wasn't exciting. Even if it wasn't new. Nothing was wrong. That was the strange part. Nothing called for urgency. Nothing demanded change. The structure worked. It held things together. It kept the world predictable, manageable, safe enough. And yet, if the observer listened closely, there was something else moving beneath the surface. Not dissatisfaction. Not longing. Just a faint sense of repetition. Like a melody that had been played so many times it no longer surprised the ear, even though it still sounded fine. Like walking a path so familiar that the scenery faded into the background. The rhythm continued. And no one questioned it. The quiet friction. It didn't arrive as a problem. There was no moment that could be pointed to and named. No clear cause. No visible disruption. The rhythm remained intact, but something subtle began to shift within it. A pause where there hadn't been one before. A breath that lingered a fraction longer than usual. The observer noticed small gaps opening between moments. Tiny spaces where nothing rushed in to fill them. They didn't last long, but they were noticeable, like silence between notes. At first, they were easy to ignore. Life continued as it always had. Movements repeated themselves. Words still made sense. The structure held. But now and then, in the middle of an action, there was a flicker of awareness. A sense of watching something happen rather than being fully inside it. Not separation, just distance. And in those brief moments, questions hovered without forming words. Not questions that demanded answers, but impressions that lingered quietly, like something waiting to be recognized. The observer could see how the rhythm didn't break, it softened. The edges blurred slightly. There was no discomfort yet. No fear. Just a mild, almost curious friction. As if two patterns were brushing against each other, neither strong enough to dominate, both present at once. It would have been easy to dismiss it. And often, it was. But the pauses kept returning. The voice that explains. When the pauses became noticeable, something else stepped in. A voice. It didn't sound harsh or urgent. It was calm, reasonable, familiar. It spoke in explanations and solutions, offering reassurance with practiced ease. This is normal. You're just tired. Things will settle once you focus. The observer recognized the tone immediately. This voice had been helpful before. It had organized chaos, solved problems, made sense of uncertainty. It knew how to restore order. And so it began to work. It filled the quiet spaces with plans. It smoothed over the pauses with purpose. It reminded the system how things had always been done, and how well that had worked so far. There was comfort in that. The rhythm tightened again. The spaces shrank. The sense of watching faded into motion. Activity resumed with renewed intent, as if clarity had returned. But something had changed. The effort was slightly heavier now. Not enough to stop anything, just enough to be noticed if someone were paying attention. Thoughts overlapped more often. Explanations repeated themselves. The voice spoke a little louder, a little more frequently. Not because it was failing. Because it was trying. The observer could see this clearly. The voice wasn't an enemy. It wasn't wrong. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Protect coherence, maintain structure, keep things moving. And yet, underneath the explanations, the pauses still existed. Waiting. The first stillness. The pause arrived without invitation. It wasn't planned. It wasn't chosen. It simply appeared in the middle of an ordinary moment, when nothing in particular was supposed to happen. The observer noticed that time didn't stop, it softened. Movement slowed, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. The usual urgency lost its edge. There was no need to rush forward, And strangely, no need to go back either. The body remained present. Breath continued. Sound existed. Light fell where it always had. But the sense of doing loosened, as if something had quietly stepped aside. For a moment, nothing asked to be managed. The voice didn't disappear. It hovered nearby, attentive, waiting to see if it would be needed. But it didn't speak right away. And in that space, that small, unoccupied space, there was a different quality of awareness. Not directed. Not searching. Just noticing. The observer could see how unfamiliar this was. Not dangerous, just unused. Like standing in a room after the music stops, noticing the hum that was always there beneath it. The stillness didn't demand attention. It allowed it. And before any conclusion could form, the rhythm resumed, gently, almost politely, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had. The unraveling. After the stillness, things continued. They had to. Life doesn't pause to explain itself. Tasks returned. Conversations resumed. The outer structure held its shape. But now, the observer could see small threads beginning to loosen. Not breaking, unraveling. Moments stretched or compressed without warning. What once felt automatic required brief attention. What once felt important sometimes arrived without weight. Identity markers, roles, expectations, self-descriptions, felt slightly transparent. Still there, still usable, but no longer solid in the same way. The voice noticed this immediately. It tried to compensate. It spoke more often now, filling space before it fully opened. It reminded, reinforced, reasserted. It suggested direction. It offered purpose. It outlined what should matter and why. And it almost worked. But the effort it took was visible now. The observer could see how maintaining the old rhythm required constant correction, like adjusting balance on uneven ground. Nothing had collapsed, but nothing settled either. There was a sense of being between. Not lost. Not found. Just no longer fully inside what had once been enough. And in that in-between space, something unfamiliar appeared. Not fear, hesitation. A quiet uncertainty about which movements were still necessary, and which were simply echoes of habit. The unraveling continued, patiently, without urgency. The resistance. When uncertainty lingers, comfort begins to call. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Comfort never needs to shout. It only needs to remind. The observer noticed how familiar patterns surfaced gently, offering their well-worn certainty. Old rhythms extended an open hand. Known reactions waited patiently, ready to be stepped back into. There was relief there. Structure. Predictability. The promise of solidity. The voice encouraged it. This worked before. There's no reason to change. You know how this goes. And for a moment, returning felt like the sensible choice. Like slipping back into shoes already shaped to the feet. The ground felt firm again. The pauses receded. But the stillness remembered itself. It didn't argue. It didn't resist the return. It simply remained present, a quiet contrast, impossible to forget once noticed. The observer could see the tension clearly now. Not a battle. A pull. One direction led back to familiarity, to the known rhythm, to a version of coherence that no longer fit quite the same way. The other direction didn't lead anywhere recognizable at all. It led into openness. And openness, without structure, felt risky, not because it was dangerous, but because it offered no script. The resistance wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. It lived in hesitation, in delay, in the temptation to postpone the unknown just a little longer. And for a time, nothing was decided. The pull remained. The letting go. There came a moment when effort simply ran out. Not in a dramatic way. Not as a decision or a failure. Just a gentle exhaustion that settled in when trying no longer seemed useful. The observer noticed how the constant adjusting slowed on its own. The voice still hovered nearby, but it spoke less often now, as if sensing that its guidance wasn't required in the same way. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was resolved. And yet, the need to resolve anything faded. Breath moved without instruction. Sensations rose and passed without commentary. The body remained present, even as the mind loosened its grip on direction. There was no choosing here. Only a quiet release of the need to choose. The observer could feel how unfamiliar this state was. Not empty, not full, simply open. As if the system had stopped bracing itself against something that was never truly an enemy. In that openness, the resistance softened. Not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer needed. And in the absence of effort, something else began to move. The flood. It didn't arrive all at once. It spread. Like water finding its level, it moved through every space that had been held closed. Thoughts lost their sharp edges. Memories drifted without pulling attention. Time became less linear, less divided into before and after. The observer noticed how boundaries blurred. Inner and outer felt closer now, not merged, but no longer clearly separate. Sound, sensation, and awareness folded into a single field of experience, where nothing stood out enough to demand control. There was weight here. Not heaviness, but depth. A sense of being immersed in something larger than any single thought or identity. The voice grew very quiet now, not silenced, just distant, like a sound heard through water. Nothing needed explanation. Nothing needed to be held in place. The flood didn't destroy anything. It washed. Old tensions dissolved. Residual urgency thinned. Patterns that once felt fixed softened into movement, rearranging themselves without instruction. The observer could see this clearly. What was happening wasn't erasure. It was repatterning. And in that immersion, awareness remained, steady, unafraid, present. The return without answers. Eventually, the water receded. Not abruptly. Not with announcement. It simply lowered, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt workable. Movement returned first. Small actions. Simple gestures. Ordinary tasks. The world looked much the same as it had before. Familiar shapes, familiar sounds. But the relationship to it had shifted. The observer noticed that the voice returned too. But it spoke differently now. Less insistently. Less often. When it did speak, it sounded more like a suggestion than a command. There were still questions. They simply no longer demanded immediate answers. Identity reassembled, loosely this time. Roles were available, but not binding. Direction existed, but without pressure. Life resumed. Not as a conclusion, as continuation. And there was a subtle sense of space around everything, as if experience no longer needed to be held so tightly to remain intact. The open ending. Nothing announced itself as complete. There was no final realization. No lesson gathered neatly at the end. No moment that could be pointed to and named as the change. And yet, something had shifted. The observer could feel it in the way moments unfolded now, with less resistance, less urgency, less need to define what was happening as it happened. The rhythm returned. But it wasn't the same rhythm as before. It breathed. Life moved forward, not because it was being pushed, but because movement was natural again. Attention flowed where it was needed, then released itself when it wasn't. And the story didn't end. It couldn't. Because this was no longer a story being told. It was life, continuing, open, unfinished, alive. And in that openness, whatever came next would write itself.